Hi everyone, it's Leela with Miss Kiss Creations. Welcome back to my channel. Today's tutorial, I'm going to show you how I created this Mermaid Milky Way tumbler. Like always, all of my materials will be listed in my description below, including some links and coupon codes. With all that being said, let's go ahead and get started with this tutorial. I wanted to first show y'all how I created the scales. So what I did was I purchased a file from Etsy and then I uploaded that file to Cricut Design Space. I wanted each scale to be 1 inch by 1 inch or close to that. So I basically just removed all of the scales on the file and I worked with one scale. I did try to resize the whole file with the scales, but I couldn't get the right size of the scale. So like I said, I removed all those scales. I took one scale and I resized it to approximately 1 inch by 1 inch using my cursor. And then I went ahead and I duplicated that until I had enough scales. I basically just remade that file with that one scale. I wanted to make sure that they didn't overlap one another because I needed all of those scales to cut out individually. So I just kept duplicating over and over again until I had enough scales. I then went to my shape section, I added a square, and then I reshaped the scale to 8.5 by 11 inches. That represents the size paper I'll be cutting the scales on, so I wanted to use that as a template. So you'll see I make that template, I add those scales over that template, I then duplicate all of those scales, and then I rearrange those scales to fit on that template. So we're not going to keep that template, we're going to then delete that template, and at the end, all we'll have are the scales. And then I had to rearrange some scales or add some scales just to fill up that entire template. Remember that template is going to be acting as just a template, and that's basically representing the paper that's going to be cutting those scales. I deleted that template. I attached all of those scales together by clicking attach so those scales can stay inside of that 8.5 by 11 inch area. And then I clicked continue to cut my scales out. I did use cardstock for my scales, just regular white cardstock I got from Amazon. I'll link that in my description. And then I used the light cardstock setting, and then I added the fast mode just to speed up the cutting process of the scales. And once all of my scales were cut off, I removed that paper, and it actually gave me a cool little stencil I can maybe use in the future, so you can always keep that just in case. And then I took my Cricut spatula, this came in handy for this, and I just scraped all of those scales off of that mat. You can work off of the mat if you want, but I just wanted all those scales to be placed in a container just so I can grab them easily whenever I apply those scales to my tumbler. So this took about 5 minutes, so I sped up the process, and I just removed them slowly, making sure I didn't bend them or rip the scales, because remember, this is paper, it is cardstock, but it's still paper and it will rip easily. And I did cut out a little bit smaller scales earlier, so I just wanted to show you I do have those on hand just in case I needed them for the tumbler or for a future project. And I have my 20-ounce skinny already prepped, painted, ready to go. I am using double-sided tape. I believe this is 1/2 inch double-sided tape. This was the biggest I had. And I'm applying this on the tumbler. This is how I'm going to apply my scales. So I take a piece, I cut it, and I place it diagonally on the tumbler. I'm not worried about it crinkling up or it not being completely flat on the tumbler. The most thing that I'm worried about is that it has that nice swirl or that nice diagonal place on the tumbler to resemble like a Milky Way. And so I just placed my first piece, and then my second piece I placed on the outer end just to make that template, or just to kind of get an idea of how big I wanted that scale area to be. And you can see all of that paper is all mushed up. It's not laying flat. Don't worry about that. It's going to lay perfectly fine and it's not going to affect how you lay down the scales. Then I took all of those other pieces of double-sided tape and then I placed them in that area one by one until the entire area was filled up with the double-sided tape. I made sure to cut any excess tape from the top and the bottom of the tumbler off before I removed that backing of the double-sided tape. You could see that backing comes off very easily, and once you place that double-sided tape on the tumbler, it is stuck. So if you do mess up, then you're probably going to have to resand the tumbler, respray paint it, and then add more double-sided tape, because the brand that I use, it's very sticky, so it works really well. And again, I'll try to find that and link that in my description below as well. And then you remove each of the backings one by one and just making sure that that tape just sticks to the tumbler. And then I went in with my first scale and I placed it on the bottom of my tumbler, creating my first row. It is very important to lay your first row very straight. You do not want this crooked, because this is basically the foundation of all your scale. So if you lay this first row crooked, then all of your scales are going to be crooked and not straight. You can see that I'm placing those scales next to each other. I'm not overlapping them, and I'm letting those tips just touch each other. Again, not overlapping. When I go to the second row, that's when I'm placing the bottom of that second row overlapped on the bottom row. So you'll see I'm going to show it to the camera just to give you an idea of how it's being placed. So that second row is slightly overlapping that bottom row, and that's how you're going to work up the entire tumbler or the entire area where you want to place your scales. Be sure to take your time with this step. This is a very important step. Make sure you're pressing down each scale. And one tip I can give y'all is make sure you are completed with that bottom row before going on to the next row, because you're overlapping. So make sure you're done with the bottom before moving on to the top. You see how I had to remove that piece of scale and lay that bottom down first and then add the top? So I kind of tricked myself out, but I removed it very slowly, and then I completed that bottom, and then I went up to the top. So you'll see that I'm just working alongside. I'm making those scales straight, but I'm still going with that double-sided tape to make sure I'm getting that nice diagonal flow around my tumbler, one scale at a time. And if I'm being honest, I think the scales have been popular on tumblers for about 3 or 4 years, and I've always been intimidated by it. I've always been scared to try the scale tumbler, so I'm really happy that I did, and this was my first time trying this tumbler. And if you've never done a scale tumbler, doing it this way gives you a step to do the entire tumbler. So I'm definitely going to do more scale tumblers in the future. It's a lot easier than what it comes off to be. It's just very time consuming, but the end result is very rewarding. And once I was finished applying all of my scales around the tumbler area, or around the area they should be laid, I finished adding the tops and the bottom, and then I took my scissors and I just cut off the excess that's hanging from the top or the bottom, and just make sure that you're getting that scissor close to the bottom, because you don't want a rough bottom. So that is very important. Make sure that paper is not hanging from the bottom, because you want a nice smooth bottom whenever you're finished. And then I took my X-Acto knife and I cut around the areas of the scale, removing any of that excess double-sided tape. You'll see that there's some areas that are sticking up with the double-sided tape, or the double-sided tape is sticking out. It was very easy removing that, taking that X-Acto knife, cutting it off, and peeling it right off that tumbler like it never existed. I thought it was going to be harder than that, but thankfully it peeled and it came right off. And then for my next step, I'm using Neon Purple from Pop of Color Paint, and I am painting the entire tumbler with this color. The reason why I chose this color is because this was the only purple or pink I have on hand, and I wanted to paint the entire tumbler. Now remember, I did not seal those scales in or anything. I'm going right in with this next step, and I'm painting the entire tumbler. I did have to paint this tumbler with 2 coats of the paint. I just wanted to make sure that it wasn't blotchy. And around the scale areas, make sure you're dabbing that paintbrush onto the scales so you can get underneath those scales to make sure there's no white showing. So you'll see I'm just dabbing around and then painting. And make sure you are painting down the tumbler, and make sure you're not painting up. So you're going with the scales. You don't want to paint up on the scales and then accidentally remove a scale or 2. And if you don't have this paint on hand, you do not have to use Pop of Color. You can also spray paint your tumbler. You can go in right with the spray paint, or you can use some acrylic paints. Don't go out buying any special products if you already have great products on hand. I do recommend whichever method you use. I would probably spray paint or paint with 2 coats just to make sure that you're getting a nice even coat of that paint on your tumbler. And it took about 15 to 20 minutes of each of the paint layers to dry. I did use a hair dryer, and I used the cold setting to make my paint dry faster. So if you're in a hurry, you can always use that. Just make sure you're not overdoing that, because with a lot of paints, using all of that air, like constant air, it tends to crack. Just keep that in mind. And once my tumbler was completely dried, I moved on to the next step, again, not having to seal this paint or anything, moving right on to applying my Tack It over and over all around my tumbler once it was dry. And make sure that that paint is dry underneath those scales. And showing y'all my Tack It over and over. I absolutely love this product. I took this right from the bottle and I painted it all around my tumbler. I'm painting it on the scales and on just the painted tumbler. I did not dilute this Tack It at all. This is pure Tack It. I wanted to make sure that it was nice and sticky for whenever I apply my micas and glitter on this tumbler. I let this Tack It dry for about 15 to 20 minutes. The way you'll know Tack It is dry is whenever it turns clear. Once that Tack It was dry, I added another layer over it just to be sure that I had all of that Tack It spread in all of those areas, and I made sure to get those nooks and crannies round those scales and make sure that it was completely covered, so when I do apply those products here in a bit, that I don't miss any areas. Again, that second coat took about 15 to 20 minutes to dry before I was able to move on to my next step. And you'll see that that tumbler is completely clear. That's how you know that Tack It is dry. I then went in with some Bubbly Mica Powder. This is from Glitter Heart Co. and this is color shifting mica powder. I used my makeup brushes that you may have seen me create in one of my older videos. I'll be linking in my description. And I placed that makeup brush inside of that mica powder and I brushed that on only the scale area. Now I tried to really go light-handed with this, but y'all know I have a heavy hand, so I just went with it and I placed that mica powder around those scale areas until that area was completely covered. If you want to make this area lighter, just add a little less mica. If you've never worked with mica powder, I always like to compare it with some eyeshadow. A little bit of eyeshadow goes a long ways, so that's exactly how mica powder is. This color shifting mica powder looked gorgeous underneath that neon purple. I had to take a smaller makeup brush to get on the edges of that tumbler just to make sure that all of the edges were nice and covered with the mica. Do keep in mind on those bare areas that doesn't have the scales, I'm going to add glitter. So if you do get a little bit of that mica powder where those scales aren't, I wouldn't worry about it too much. I chose to add the mica powders before the glitter because that mica powder is lighter and it's more fine, so I can cover that mica up with glitter rather than trying to cover the glitter up with the mica powder. So I hope that makes sense. And remember, your entire tumbler is going to be sticky at this point, so be very careful. That area still has the tacket on it, and we're going to move right into glitter after applying all of the micas on the tumbler. And now to apply my glitter, I'm using Mermaid Kisses from Mass Craft Supply. It's this beautiful holographic purple that I absolutely love. I'm going to apply that right over that area where it does not have the scales or the mica powder. Remember that tacket is still on the tumbler. It's still sticky and tacky, so that glitter is going to be placed right over those areas and it's going to look beautiful. And once all of my glitters placed on that area, I took my finger and I rubbed all of that excess glitter off of the tumbler. So you don't have to rub very hard, but you'll see that I'm rubbing lightly, and you'll see the difference between the glitter just being placed on the tumbler and those areas where I rubbed with my finger. Now, this is one of the reasons why I wanted to choose the holographic glitter, because whenever you rub this off with the tacket method, it just creates such a beautiful shine, and you can see those colors within that holographic glitter. It's just beautiful. And look how that turned out so far. It shines so much. I love that Mermaid Kisses purple. It is perfect for this tumbler. I then took my fan brush and I made sure to get any of that excess glitter off of the scale area. I wanted to make sure that only had mica powder and no glitter. And then I went outside and I sprayed my tumbler 2 times with this Krylon Crystal Clear acrylic coating. You can also use clear spray paint. Once that was dry, it took about 20 to 25 minutes. I then went into epoxying my tumbler. For the first coat of epoxy, I am using my Fast Set epoxy. I'm using a total of 20 milliliters of epoxy. That's 10 milliliters part A and 10 milliliters part B, totaling 20 milliliters of epoxy. I then let my tumbler spin on the cup turner for about 2 hours, and with the Fast Set epoxy, it takes about 2 to 3 hours for the epoxy to be cured to the touch. So I made sure that it was completely cured before moving on to my next step. And once that tumbler was cured, you can see how much sparkle is on this tumbler. It is absolutely gorgeous. I then took a 180 grit sanding block and I sanded around the tumbler. I didn't really need to sand too hard or too much really. I just sanded the bottom and some areas on the scales where they were sticking up a little bit, but honestly, the scales weren't sticking up at all. I was very surprised how this tumbler turned out. I then took an X-Acto knife and I cleaned up the rim of the tumbler. I do this after I epoxy each step. I just want to make sure that the tumbler is clear of epoxy and any excess paint. And then I took that sanding block again and I sanded around the rim just so my last coat of epoxy, I can get that nice seal. And once I was finished touching around the tumbler, I took 91% alcohol to remove any of that sanding particles or any oils I may have transferred over to my tumbler. And the next step is adding the Milkyway Effect to the tumbler. I mixed a total of 40 milliliters of epoxy for this tumbler, and I am placing 5 milliliters of epoxy in 3 separate cups. I'm later going to add some acrylic paint to these cups, so once you apply approximately 5 milliliters of epoxy to these cups, just place them aside and then we'll work on those later. I'm then going to take the rest of that epoxy and apply that to the tumbler. I ended up adding about 20 milliliters of epoxy to my tumbler, so I had a little bit of epoxy left over. I didn't want too much epoxy on my tumbler, but you want enough so when you add that acrylic paint over this epoxy, it's going to give it a nice swirl. So I decided to use white, this Key West, which is a nice teal, and then a lavender from Apple Barrel. They're all acrylic paints. It does not matter the finish of the acrylic paints. I just chose whichever colors I wanted to choose. And then I added those acrylic paints into the epoxy. Just one tiny little dot of the paint was enough for that little amount of epoxy. And then I stirred each of those colors together until I saw one solid color inside of the cup. You'll see that I used my heat gun for this. I just used this to warm up the tumbler, but I waited at least 30 seconds to make sure that that tumbler was not hot, but to make sure that it was just warm. You do not want that tumbler to be hot because when you apply that acrylic paint onto the tumbler, you're going to see it separate. So make sure it is not burning hot. You want to make sure your tumbler is just warm enough so whenever you apply these paints to the tumbler, they just spread a little bit, but they don't dissolve or separate too much. And you'll see I'm just adding that acrylic paint mixture on that purple area. I wanted to personally just add that Milkyway Effect on the purple area and leave those scales blank. But if you want to add this effect all over the tumbler and kind of have a peekaboo effect with those scales, go ahead and create your tumbler the way that you want to create it. I'm sure it's going to look beautiful no matter what. And again, adding a little bit of heat on low to my tumbler just to loosen up that epoxy just a little bit, but not heat up that epoxy so much to separate those paints. And always be cautious of overheating your tumbler. A lot of people have problems with their paints or even alcohol inks mushing together and kind of becoming muddy or dark brown. That's because you're adding a lot of heat to your tumbler. Be sure to add heat on low and make sure you're doing it little bits at a time, just in little tiny bits. Make sure it's about 6 inches away from your tumbler so you're not overheating and mushing those colors. And once the paint was placed on my tumbler, I went in with a wooden stick and I pressed along my tumbler. So I'm pressing on the epoxy and I'm making sure that I'm smearing that paint around the tumbler. I'm doing little zigzags and I'm just making sure that that paint isn't in a straight line, but it's like showing like a Milky Way effect and it's kind of having fun, you know? So they're mixing a little bit, but they're not mixing too much where that paint is becoming mushy or muddy. And remember, I wanted to keep my paints in my purple area, so after I was finished with this tumbler, I made sure to check on this tumbler about every 15 minutes for the first hour or two to make sure those paints didn't go over to the scale area. If they did move over to the scale area, I just took my wooden stick again and I just removed that paint from the scale area and it removed it completely, and it still had epoxy on there and you were able to see just the scales. And here's the tumbler spinning while the epoxy is still curing. I did not use fast set for this step because it would dry too quickly. So I let my tumbler spin on the cup turner for 4 hours. I then turned off my cup turner and then let my tumbler air dry or air cure for another 20 hours. The total drying time of 24 hours. And if you plan on adding a decal to this tumbler, make sure to sand your tumbler once cured with a 180 grit sanding block. Add your decal and then add about 15 to 20 milliliters of epoxy over that decal and your tumbler will be ready to go. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed creating it for y'all. If you did, please be sure to give this video a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more Tumbler and craft videos. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.